Chapter 26. The Sound of War. Dak had tried to hold on to hope as he, Rick, and a large group of others were sent in a horse-drawn cart through the massive army toward the front line. He kept telling himself that Sera would make a difference, figure out what to do, save them, that he and Rick would find his parents and have a happy reunion, then hang out until someone figured out that this group of people from the future didn't belong on any side of an army, let alone the front. But that hope was fleeting. As Dak saw the countless soldiers and weapons and horses and the bleak looks on the faces of those ready to fight, fear filled him. He realized through and through just how mighty the army was, which meant whomever they were prepping to fight must be scary as heck too. What could Sera possibly do to save them from this mess? They jostled along, weaving their way through a small break in the sea of soldiers, heading toward their deaths. Dak just hoped that he could be with his parents when it happened, that they could die together. "You're looking awfully glum," Rick said. "I should be more happy, huh? I mean, check this out. I'm about to get killed in a famous historical war. Yippee, right?" "Right." Dak stared at the linguist, a guy who'd sneakily become one of his best friends. He seemed to have so much going on behind his eyes that curiosity went out over all that "I'm about to die" stuff. "What in Rasputin's name are you thinking about over there?" he asked. Rick yawned, then slightly shook his head. "Just wondering what I can do for this world." Dak didn't know what answer he'd expected, but certainly not that. What you can do for the world? Really? I'd say you've done quite a bit so far. And hey, if we die, there's still a pretty decent chance that Alexander doesn't, especially with Sera on the loose. So we saved the world, dude. If I had some root beer, we'd celebrate. He was trying to cheer things up, and he was afraid he was doing a poor job of it. "No, man, you don't get it." Rick stared off into the distance as he spoke. "Yeah, I think you're right that we'll fix the prime break, avoid the cataclysm and all that, but that doesn't mean that the world still doesn't have a lot of room for improvement." Dak nodded slowly, showing his best face of contemplation. "Well said. If somehow we don't get gored by 100 spears, we can start a charity." Rick laughed, the worst courtesy laugh Dak had ever heard. "Yeah, but I just wonder about this time and place, about King Philip and Alexander. It seems like, I don't know, it seems like they need better guidance. With all this power, they could do a lot of good for civilization, for the future." "What are you trying to say?" Dak asked. Something in Rick's tone had scared him. Rick never got a chance to answer. People up ahead had started shouting, all their voices scrambling together to make it impossible for the translator in Dak's ear to pick up anything. A tension seemed to pass through the crowds of soldiers like a visible wave, and somewhere, rising in volume, was the sound of thunder, a rolling, thumping noise that shook the ground. The guard in charge of the horses that had been leading their cart turned around to face them, his face snapped tight with fear, eyes wide. "They're attacking us!" he screamed, then lifted his sword and, for some reason, severed the ropes connecting the horses to the cart. He slapped their rears and shooed them back in the direction from which they'd just come. "Get out!" he shouted at Dak and everyone else. "Grab your weapons and get out! There's no more time! By authority of the hegemon, I order you to make your way to the front line and help us stop the enemy's charge! No!" The soldier held his sword out as if he'd chop off the head of the first person who refused to obey. Rick was already on his feet, reaching out to help Dak stand. They grabbed their own swords, rusty and dented and dull, from a pile in the front of the cart. Then they jumped to the ground to join the others, most of them too old, too young, or too frail to fight off a chicken, much less an army of Persians. Terror rattled Dak's heart, made it hard to breathe, but somehow Rick was keeping his cool, like he'd done this 1,000 times. "Come on," he said to Dak. "Come on, we can survive this. Stay by me, and we can do it. Come on." As they started running through the melee, going in the direction ordered by the guard, Dak struggled for every breath. He knew Rick was lying, saying whatever it took to make him feel better, and Dak loved him for it. They ran off to war. Sera had stood to the side of the cavernous tent for 20 minutes or so, watching the king, his son, Aristotle, and many others excitedly talk about what was going on just a few miles from where they stood. They'd been planning to take the fight wherever they needed to go, and soon. But their enemies had brought it to them instead. The hegemon seemed just fine with that, judging by the expression of something like glee on his face as he pointed at maps and barked orders left and right. The only times he ever paused were to take big gulps of wine from a pewter cup, which his page continually refilled. A soldier came through the front flap of the tent and didn't wait for permission to speak before he yelled what he had come to say.
"They've broken through the front line! It's all out war!"
Sera's heart shriveled like a rotted raisin. Rick, Dak's parents. How could they possibly survive? Her only hope was that maybe they hadn't gotten far before the fighting had begun. Maybe they were stuck in the middle of the huge army, safe for the moment. Dak, she thought. Oh, Dak, Rick, please be safe. Please? She didn't know what she'd do if she lost her best friends after all they'd been through. The hustle and bustle of planning and shouting orders continued inside the tent. Every minute or so, a soldier would leave, sprinting, ready to carry those orders out into the field. At the same rate, others would return with progress reports. The whole thing seemed like chaos, but Sera was sadly familiar with it by now. It seemed to her that war was all too similar across cultures and epochs. She then noticed something very odd that everyone else, amid that very chaos, had failed to realize yet. The king had sat down. Just a few minutes earlier, he'd been animated, throwing around his arms, stomping his feet, yelling and screaming. Now he sat as others continued in his place, and he looked weak, pale. He slumped in the gilded chair, seeming to shrink right before her eyes. Every ounce of blood had drained from his face. And then she knew. Poison. The wine. Then, to her horror, she saw Alexander with the cup in his hand. The page must have just handed it to him. His hands had been empty before, but now he had some of the wine. He was raising it to his lips. No! She screamed. She was running, jumping over bunched-up carpets, pushing people out of her way. The cup was almost to Alexander's lips. She ran harder, the tent suddenly feeling like it was a mile wide. No! She screamed again. Alexander opened his mouth. Sera took another step. Alexander tilted the cup, tilted his head. Sera reached him. Diving, she lashed her hand out and knocked the cup away from the man's hand, sending a spray of red wine all over the place. The cup fell to the ground with a thump and a bounce, and wine fell like droplets of rain onto the carpet. Sera landed and rolled, now on her back, looking up at Alexander, who glared down at her with more surprise than fury.
"What in the name of Zeus?"
he called out. But all she could do was smile. Despite it all, despite knowing her friends might be dead, despite the loss of the king, she smiled. A thing of triumph, not glee. In that moment, without a shred of doubt, Sera knew she had just prevented the cataclysm, once and for all. Mission complete. Chapter 27. The Rage of War. Dak had once daydreamed of moments like this, so often. Lying in bed, sitting in class, staring at a book without comprehending the words, imagining himself in one of history's great wars, wielding a sword, bearing down on his enemies with all the wrath of a Greek god on the cusp of defeat. If he learned one thing during his travels, it's that real war was far from glamorous. This battle was no exception. Most of the time, he just tried to avoid getting trampled by people on his own team, and he'd yet to stab or maim so much as a big toe. Sticking close to Rick, they weaved their way through the chaos of battle, doing their very best not to kill or be killed. An enemy soldier loomed over them, appearing out of a thick knot of clashing warriors, a spear raised with both hands. His face wore a scowl of hatred, like he'd been oppressed his whole life by 2 kids from the future. Rick swung his sword upward just as the man's thrust came down, shattering the wood of the weapon into a dozen pieces. The man screamed bloody murder, but a tide of battling bodies swept him away, and Rick and Dak ran, threading through and dodging the clashes as best they could. Dak had no idea where Rick was trying to go, but he had a sudden and desperate dependency on the older boy. Dust filled the air, along with screams and grunts, the clang of metal against metal, the peal of horses in pain, and thunderous roars of battle that all melded together into a chorus of war and rage. As much as Dak loved history and reading about wars, he'd never again wish to be in the middle of one. Soldiers attacked them. Dak and Rick survived moment to moment, deflecting weapons, dodging, running. On they went. They broke into a rare clearing, and what Dak saw before him made the entire world freeze into a bubble of silence and wonder. Every sound a buzz in his ears, barely heard over the hammering of his heart. 10 feet away, his parents lay on the ground, clasped in each other's arms. Sera rode on the back of a horse, her arms holding onto Aristotle's waist. She gripped him so hard that her muscles ached, but she was terrified of falling off the charging beast. Alexander rode beside them on Bucephalus, the new king standing in the stirrups, his right arm brandishing a sword forward as if it had the power to cut through the sea of battling soldiers before them, which seemed to stretch to every horizon. Other soldiers, also on horses, flanked them on both sides as they surged ahead, moving like an icebreaker ship hacking its way through the Arctic. Sera just squeezed her grip and rested her head on Aristotle's back, wanting to close her eyes, as if that would make it all go away. The scenes of battle, the horror of it, made her wince. It was all just so awful. She hoped, desperately, that they could achieve what Alexander had promised once her explanations had been given in the tent, to find Dak and Rick, to find Dak's parents, and to take them away from the raging war, to take them to safety. Sera had saved Alexander's life, though not until she'd seen the hegemon die from the poison. But perhaps that's what was fated to happen all along. For Alexander to lead the armies of Greece, here and now. For Alexander III to become Alexander the Great.
There!
Aristotle roared, shockingly loud considering the noise around them.
I see them!
He was pointing madly to their right. And then came the words that eased the cinch around her heart for the first time in hours.
They're still alive!
Alexander altered course. Dak hadn't lived that many years when it really got down to it. But in his decade or so of life, especially since being recruited to the historians, he'd experienced a lot of different emotions. Happy and sad, victorious and disappointed, despair, anger, love, hate, lots of stuff. But never, not once, had he ever felt the thing that swelled within him at the sight of his parents, alive, huddling in each other's arms as armies fought around them. It was a thing that he'd never be able to explain and would probably never feel again. Tears stung his eyes, and a wonderful pain filled his chest. There they were, his parents.
Mom!
He yelled.
Dad!
He was already sprinting toward them, almost oblivious to the danger that swarmed in from all directions. From what he could see, it looked as if his mom had tripped and fallen over a wounded soldier, and then his dad had joined her, practically on top of her, like a shield. Dak slid to the ground on his knees, coming to a stop just a few inches short of his parents. Finally, they both turned their heads to see their son. Even as they did so, 2 men clashed swords right above them, the crack of metal against metal vibrating through the air. Luckily, the soldiers, swords locked, moved to the side. The sounds of war everywhere else raged on. "Dak," his dad said. The poor man's face was pale with worry, his skin tight, fear burning in his eyes. The word came out almost as a whisper, more disbelief than anything else. "You're safe now," Dak replied, having no clue what else to say. His mom saw him, but her whole face was pinched up and tears streamed from her eyes. Finally, Dak just lunged forward and they all hugged, gripping one another and crying and trying to say words, but none that came out intelligible. Death and mayhem surrounded them, but for that moment, they were all alive, and they were together. After months of chasing through time after time, they were together. It took a universe of effort for Rick to stand still and allow Dak to have his moment with his parents. He couldn't think of a much worse place to have a family reunion, But the Smiths hadn't had much choice in the matter. Finally, when the hug and joy had gone on for a good 20 seconds, Rick had to speak up. "Dak," he called out, "none of this will do much good if we get ourselves killed. We need to protect ourselves." He did a quick turn, his weapon held out, ready to fight off anyone close. They'd been lucky enough to find themselves in a random clearing of the fight, but that wouldn't last much longer. Dak scrambled to his feet, slyly wiping a tear on his shoulder. He helped his parents stand up, then they all moved closer to Rick, forming a circle with their backs to one another. A man with a veil over his face, spear held high, charged at them, screaming words too laced with bloodlust to comprehend. Fear thumped inside Rick, but he kept it at bay, waiting, forcing himself to remain still until the very last second. With a yell, he lifted his sword with both hands, striking the spear just before it slammed into his own chest. The man was taken off guard, losing his balance as he tried to rebound from his spear being swatted upward, and he fell flat on his back. Rick raised his sword and screamed, glowering with all the anger he could muster at an enemy he didn't know. It was just enough that the guy rolled away, got up, and ran back into the thicker melee of battling soldiers. "Not bad," Mr. Smith said. "Looks like you guys have picked up a few tricks while chasing us through time." "Lovely spot for a family vacation," his wife added. Rick didn't have time to respond. The man he thought he'd just defeated reappeared, and this time he had 7 or 8 of his companions with him. After pushing his way through a wall of clashing soldiers, the guy raised his spear and pointed its sharp tip right at Rick. And then they all charged in. Chapter 28. Upon the Horses. Sera's elation at hearing that her friends were still alive only lasted a moment. When she finally got a good look at them, when Alexander changed their course and the other horses followed, she saw that Dak and the others were back together in a group, and a crowd of robed soldiers was coming at them with weapons raised. "Dak!" she screamed, as if that could help him at all. "Rick, run!" She felt so hopeless, and the words sounded stupid. Trying to will the horses to gallop faster, she stared, her heart rattling with terror. The leading man, holding a spear out in front of him as if he wanted to pole vault, reached Dak's group first, but Rick took a step forward, swinging an old dented sword in an arc that snapped the spear into 2 pieces. Sera cheered loudly before she could help herself, and despite knowing that it had been a lucky shot and that plenty of death was coming in right behind the first guy. Swords were raised, battle yells were roared. For a split second, Sera caught a glimpse of Dak's face, and it was painted white with fear. She felt such a rush of concern and love for her friend that it felt like she might explode. And then Alexander was on them. His mighty horse, Bucephalus, charged into the crowd of onrushing soldiers, tossing them to the sides like stalks of corn. They scrambled and dove, and a couple of them weren't lucky enough to avoid the hammering hooves of the beast. Rick turned away from it and shoved Dak and the Smiths to safety, even as Alexander stood up in his stirrups and started swinging away with his sword, cutting down the enemy at a speed that seemed impossible. His companions joined in, just as more of the robed fighters appeared to help their friends. In a matter of seconds, it had turned into an all-out battle of clanging swords and shouts of pain. "Go get 'em!" Sera yelled into Aristotle's ear. "Get them!" She knew he understood, and their horse leapt toward Dak and the others, even before the words had finished coming out of her mouth. Dak had a million thoughts go through his mind in an instant. Mostly, he was fixated on how ridiculously brave Rick had become, fighting off dudes with that old sword of his. For a long moment, it felt as if Rick was all that stood between them and certain death. But then there were horses, Alexander, chaos, sword swinging, and men screaming. Then he heard his name. Dak! He looked up and saw a horse coming right at him, leaping over fallen soldiers. Aristotle had the reins, a fierceness gripping his features. Sera was behind him, holding onto him with one arm and pointing at Dak with the other. "Mom! Dad! Quick!" he yelled at his parents. He grabbed them by the arms and pulled them close, then waited for Aristotle's horse to pull up right beside them. "Quick! Get on!" They tried to complain, tried to insist he get on first, but he ignored them, finding strength he never knew he had, practically lifting them onto the horse himself. Sera had slipped off, helping out. "What are you doing?" he yelled at her, even as his mom was able to finally get her legs situated correctly on both sides of the horse. "You can't fit that many people," she answered with a quick jerk of her head behind them. Another couple of horses were waiting for them, their riders keeping all enemy soldiers at bay with their swords. Dak made sure his parents were secure behind Aristotle, then swatted the horse's rear end to get it going. With a loud whinny, it galloped off, dodging soldiers as it went. Dak followed Sera toward another horse and rider that had come with the philosopher. Dak noticed that Rick had not backed down from the fight. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Alexander and his companions. "Rick!" he yelled at him. "We need to go! Come on!" His friend swatted away a sword, then turned to look back. "No! Just go! I'll make sure you can escape!" But he'd hardly said the last word before he vaulted into the air, lifted by a man on a white horse that had come out of nowhere, breaking through the line of defense set up by Alexander and his partners. "Rick!" Dak shouted, this time with horror. An enemy soldier had just single-handedly picked Rick up like a bag of leaves and thrown him across the saddle of the horse. The man kicked the sides of the animal, and it burst into a gallop, charging away. Dak knew they had to follow, but he had barely looked up at the horse he'd hoped to ride with Sera when a thrown spear hurtled through the air and landed with a sickening thunk in the friendly rider's chest. He groaned, his eyes rolling up into his head. Then he toppled off the horse and onto the ground. It was like the entire world had just shifted on its plates. Dak held off the panic that tried to paralyze him. He had to act. Alexander and everyone else were too busy fighting. "Come on, Sera!" he yelled, motioning for her to jump onto the now riderless animal. She didn't argue or hesitate. Throwing a foot into the stirrup, she was up there in 3 seconds. Dak followed, almost knocking her off when he swung his leg around to the other side. He'd planned on being in front, but somehow she'd ended up in the driver's seat. "Ride!" he yelled. Sera turned to him and shouted back, "What about your parents?" "They'll be safe with Aristotle." "And Alexander?" Dak shook with impatience. "Look at the dude! He's in his element! Now ride!" "You got it!" Sera shook the reins and made a nickering sound that somehow rose above the din of battle around them, and the horse leapt into motion, jumping over wounded soldiers as it fell into pursuit, chasing after Rick. Dak held on tight. Chapter 29. A Sea of War. As much as Alexander was in his element, Sera was far out of hers, and she knew it. Holding onto the reins so fiercely that her fingers hurt, she kept her eyes riveted to what lay before her, directing as best she could, swinging around one-on-one clashes, hearing the ring of sword against sword, jumping over fallen soldiers, dashing through every break that opened up, all the while following the man who'd taken Rick. Luckily, the horse they rode seemed battle-tested and intelligent, knowing what to do and acting even before Sera tried to drive the reins. Most people in the army were too busy attacking or defending to pay them notice, and on they rode. Dak was hurting her middle. He squeezed so tight from behind, but it was comforting to know he was there and safe. For now, at least. A soldier was running toward the path right ahead of them, coming in at an angle so he could intercept them. Dak yelled for her to look out. "I see him," she called back. "Put your foot to good use." She felt Dak shift behind her, leaning toward the right a bit. She leaned the other direction to maintain their balance. She didn't know why this one particular soldier had singled them out. Maybe he just wanted some easy prey. But he came up to their side just as she rode the horse through a narrow clearing between major clashes of fighting soldiers. With a scowl that chilled her blood, he pulled out a dagger and made as if to throw it, aiming. "Now!" Sera yelled. Dak kicked out and knocked the knife away, then shifted his foot the other direction to smack the guy in the face so he couldn't attempt to pull them off. Screaming obscenities, the man fell into a patch of mud just in time for 2 soldiers to trip and fall on top of him. Sera caught only a brief glance, but no one in the trio seemed too happy about the situation. Dak had almost slipped completely off, but he righted himself behind her. She could feel the heavy breaths in his chest as he leaned into her and got his grip again. They'd gained ground on Rick despite the little altercation. Sera willed the horse to go even faster. Surprisingly, Rick felt no fear. Maybe, after overcoming so much, he'd finally grown cold to terror. hardened up, grown thicker skin. Whatever the reason, he felt a calming wave slow his pulse as he was jostled along, thrown across the back of the enemy's horse like a big bag of grain. The man who'd heaved him off the ground was shockingly strong, having quashed every tiny effort Rick had made to squirm out of the position. When it proved impossible, he decided to wait it out. Wait until the perfect opportunity presented itself. He didn't understand why he'd been taken. Maybe this guy had seen a chance to have a prisoner. Maybe he thought Rick was a close friend to Alexander, since they'd been fighting side by side. Maybe the dude just wanted an excuse to get away from the battle and save his own skin. It didn't matter. Rick had no intention of reaching whatever the soldier's destination happened to be. Risking the man's wrath, he turned his head to look back in the direction from which they'd come. The horse jumped over something just as he did it, and his chin banged against the leather of the saddle. He bit his lip and cried out in pain. The rider punched him right in the kidneys. The pain was intense, a flash of agony. But then Rick saw Sera, and Dak behind her, sitting on a horse, coming at him, coming for him. My friends, he thought. Almost there, Dak yelled, every muscle in his body tense. There was something amazing about riding on a horse like this, especially through a sea of fighting armies. The adrenaline pumping through him seemed like it had been amped up 1,000,000 times over. What do we do? Sera shouted without turning back to him. Dak knew keeping the horse under control had to take a ridiculous amount of concentration. Dak had no idea how to answer. Just get close! Something brilliant will pop into my head! She muttered something that he couldn't hear. He imagined it was something to the effect of, we'd be better off using my head? But this was Dak's moment. He felt as if the others had saved him so often and had, whether meaning to or not, always treated him like the annoying little brother. But today, he planned on becoming the big brother. The sounds of war, screams and clanks and yells and grunts filled the air as they rushed past countless soldiers battling one another. Sometimes the sight of it was gruesome, and Dak had no idea who was winning, but they kept their course, dodging and weaving and jumping whenever they needed to. Rick was only a few feet ahead of them now, the dirt kicked up by that horse's hooves dusting the nose of their own horse. The thunderous roar of their galloping thumped in Dak's ears. Then, just like that, he knew what he was going to do, and he was glad he didn't have time to think it over. Pull to the left! He yelled at Sera. Get as close as you can! Thankfully, she didn't ask for any more details and guided the horse accordingly. Seeing her trusting him like this, following his command, made the whole ordeal worth it. Unless he died. He really didn't want to die. The horse kicked into high gear and lunged ahead, pulling even with Rick and his captor, who looked over at them like he'd just seen an alien spaceship zoom in. He yelled something unintelligible, then reached for the sword that hung from his waist, holding Rick down with his other hand. But Dak wasn't going to let him get his weapon or do anything else. Holding onto Sera's shoulders for leverage, he brought both of his legs up until he could get his feet under him, then crouched on the saddle. The soldier had grabbed the hilt of the sword, had started to pull the weapon from its sheath. Dak straightened his legs with full force and jumped, leaping across the narrow gap between the horses and slamming headfirst into the shoulder of Rick's captor. The man slipped several inches, but then grabbed the pommel of his saddle, fighting for balance. Dak wrapped his arms around him and fought like crazy, tugging at the big guy with what little strength he had, trying to get him off the horse. Rick was free now, but in too awkward of a position to do much. Dak could see him attempting to get into a sitting position, but the horse's jouncing movement slammed him back onto his stomach. Dak kept struggling, avoiding the man's punches and elbows, weaving and ducking his head in all directions. Squeezing as tightly as possible with his arms lassoed around the soldier's chest, Dak picked up his flailing feet and settled their soles against the side of the horse. Then he jerked backward with his arms and kicked out with his feet. It worked. He and the soldier tumbled off of the horse and slammed into the ground. Rick scrambled, twisting this way and that until he could finally get in a position to throw himself into the seat of the now empty saddle. Filled with dread at what might have happened, or would happen to Dak, he grabbed the reins and pulled back, too much, too fast. The horse reared up on its back legs, kicking its front ones, and Rick toppled off as well, landing with a graceless thump onto the ground. But then he was on his feet, running. He saw Dak and the soldier who'd kidnapped him, each struggling to gain the upper hand. Even as he looked, Rick saw the man climb on top, pinning Dak down with his legs. "No!" Rick shouted, running harder. The soldier pulled a dagger out of some hidden pocket, lifted it toward the sky, ready to drive it down and end Dak's life. Rick was too far away. His throat almost ripped from the scream that burst out of his lungs. The man's arms swung with a mighty force toward Dak's chest. There was a blur of movement, a flash of brown, an inhuman squeal of rage. Like magic, from nowhere, Sera and her horse jumped out of the nearby fray, leaping through the air. The animal's front hooves crashed into the soldier on top of Dak, throwing him violently off and sending the dagger in a flying spin until it landed with a thud in a patch of flattened grass. The soldier lay still to the side of Dak, dazed or dead. Rick didn't care. He picked up his friend, finding strength from somewhere deep, and threw him onto the horse behind Sera. Then he himself used a stirrup to join them, leaping onto the horse's back, reaching forward to squeeze both Sera and Dak in one big hug. "Go!" he yelled. And they went. Chapter 30. The King's Right-Hand Man. Dak realized now that he knew almost nothing about war and its horrors. But there was one thing he'd come to understand, and it was hard-won wisdom. Rarely were there true winners in a battle, what with the lives lost, injuries sustained, and loved ones devastated. But he had a feeling that the armies of Alexander would cross the world and do good things in the long run, despite the losses and heartache. And, at least for one day, they'd taken a successful step and driven back the armies of Persia and their surprise invasion. Now he sat with his friends around a fire, its smoke floating up like a stream of ghosts to disappear out of a hole in the top of King Philip's tent. The former hegemon, now dead. Alexander was king now, and he sat on a stool staring at the flames, probably brooding about how much his life had changed in such a short time. He'd never wept for his father, but his face had shown it all, especially when he'd ridden back into camp atop his majestic horse, Bucephalus. As for Dak and his friends, they'd ridden fast and hard, finally finding a break in the battle, enough to get outside the main sea of soldiers and take the long way back to camp, where they'd finally been treated with the respect and care they deserved. Dak was exhausted, sapped of energy, and aching from a million cuts and bruises. Rick and Sera were no better by the looks of it. They'd hardly said a word since returning. But they'd won. As far as they could tell, they'd won. The great breaks had all been fixed. Dak was nervous about going back to the future. A small part of him dreaded it, worried that they'd pop into a nightmare of a world on the brink of collapse and destruction. But most of him, all the good parts, knew they'd succeeded. How he could be so sure, he had no clue. But deep down, he just knew it. Aristotle looked the worst out of all of them. The man stood up, his robes and hair filthy, his face marked with a dozen small wounds.
"We must return to Corinth," he said. "Olympias and Pausanias have been taken there, ready to be judged for their crimes against our former king. We have a long journey ourselves."
He raised a hand to stop Sera before she could even get the words out.
"No, my child. My days using the infinity ring are over, I'm afraid. We'll be traveling the old-fashioned way."
Dak liked the sound of that. He liked it a lot. A trip through Greece? Seeing the sights? His spirits lifted 1,000 times. Plus, what was the rush getting back to their own day? They had all the time in the world. He snickered at his brilliant thought, something he'd been waiting a long time to think.
"What do you think about your parents disappearing?"
Alexander suddenly asked. The man rarely spoke, and when he did, he made you want to jump through hoops to give him a good answer.
"Troubling, is it not?"
Actually, it wasn't. Sera had warned him that it would happen, which had given him an opportunity to say goodbye to his mom and dad before they'd ghosted out. Because they had been cut loose in the time stream without the ring, it was the great breaks that had kept them stuck in the past, warping from one break to another until only the prime break remained. And with that now fixed, the fabric of reality was able to heal itself. That meant anomalies like Dak's parents were being sent back, where they belonged. At least that's what Sera had said. Dak was too tired to doubt any of it. "I'm not worried," he told Alexander, not wanting to start a discussion about the intricacies of time travel. "My mom and dad have always had their own way of doing things. We'll see them soon enough." The new king nodded, surely thinking about how he'd just lost his own parents. But he was too focused on the huge task ahead of him to let anything daunt him for long.
"I admire your spirit, boy. I liked you from the instant I saw you climb the statue of Plato. May the gods bless you all."
He stood up as if to leave, even though it was his own tent now, but Rick didn't let him go. "Wait," he said. King, Lord Hegemon." He looked at Dak in desperation, not knowing how to address him. "Just call him Alexander," Dak replied, loving every second of it.
"Speak your mind," the king ordered. "I'm weary and need to rest for the battles to come."
Rick straightened, his chest puffing out. "I'd like to join your army, fight by your side." Dak and Sera were on him in an instant, throwing out questions left and right. The world suddenly felt surreal and unstable again, as if the brakes hadn't been corrected after all. What could he possibly be talking about? "You guys? Stop," Rick said quietly. But something in his face silenced Dak completely, and he knew there'd be no changing his friend's mind. Rick wasn't going back with them. "Both of you knew this was coming. My future was altered, and I can't go back." He lowered his voice. "But I can have a future here, and I can make a difference. These people need my help. I think their intentions are good, but they obviously have a lot to learn about civility and treating other cultures with respect. I can do them a lot of good." "But," Dak started, and didn't finish. His heart hurt. Sera's face had melted into the saddest frown he'd ever seen. "But," he repeated. "Trust me, okay?" Rick replied, reaching out to squeeze both Dak's and Sera's shoulders. "This is what I have to do." "What about Kisa?" Sera asked. "You could go and be with her in the Maya." Rick shook his head. "No, she has her own destiny. Mine is here, to help Alexander change the world. And hey, what's the big deal? You have a time travel device. You can come visit me anytime you want. Duh." He smiled, then turned his gaze to the king. "Will you have me, Hegemon?" Alexander, tired and worn out as he might be, looked every bit a king as he walked over and stood in front of Rick.
"I'd be honored to have you by my side. I really would. And there you'll be, always, to the four corners of the earth. But I'm giving you a new name. A Greek name. You are a builder, a maker. And so I name you after Hephaestus, god of fire. From this day forward, you'll be known as Hephaestion. Be back here at dawn to plan our next move."
And with that, Alexander left, leaving his own tent to Rick and the others for their goodbyes. Dak felt no shame as he hugged his two best friends in the world and bawled his eyes out. Chapter 31. Dinosaurs. Sera looked up, way up, and saw something that she surely never imagined she would, the long, long neck of an Apatosaurus. Its gigantic mouth munched and munched as it tore the leaves off of a tree. She wasn't dreaming. This was real, and it had all been Aristotle's idea. "Cool," Dak whispered, staring above with his mouth hanging open like the cargo door of a giant airplane. "Cool." Olympias, mother of Alexander III, wearer of amethysts, plotter of murders, sat upon a stone, her hands and feet bound by a material that the great philosopher said would dissolve within a few hours. Right next to her, Pausanias himself sat, tied up and brooding like a punished child. He was an ugly guy, and Sera was anxious to warp back to the time of Greece so she wouldn't have to see his traitorous face anymore. "How could you do this to us?" Olympias asked, as calm, cool, and collected as Sera had ever seen her. "How will you go throughout the rest of your lives, living with the guilt of leaving us here to be eaten by these monsters?" "Oh, stop your complaining," Dak answered, finally pulling his gaze from the enormous beast that towered above them. This region is dominated by herbivores, and there's plenty of food and fresh water for you guys to live long, happy years together. You deserve each other. Just be glad that Aristotle didn't let them throw you in the dark dungeons like the hegemon ordered. This is paradise. Sera did feel a little guilty, but Dak made a great point. Alexander had felt so utterly betrayed by his own mother that he'd wanted the harshest of punishments. Olympias and Pausanias were actually getting off easy, way easy. Most civilizations would have put them to death. In fact, Alexander intended to tell everyone that Pausanias, at least, had been killed. The new hegemon couldn't afford to look weak.
"Whatever helps you sleep at night," Pausanias grumbled. "Just please explain why I saw doubles of you two while we were journeying here."
Sera almost laughed. She'd inputted a wrong number when calculating the warp back to prehistoric times, and they'd appeared just as their doubles were leaving the stables to go back and stop Tilda from killing Alexander the first time. Thinking about it confused even her, so she couldn't imagine what Olympias and her partner in crime thought about it. "It'll give you something to ponder for the rest of your life," Dak answered. "With the dinosaurs. I'm kind of jealous, to be honest. Seems like a cool place. And don't worry, T-Rexes don't come around these parts."
"T-Rexes?"
Olympias asked, looking baffled. "Never mind." "Come on," Sera said, stepping back beside Dak and holding out the infinity ring. "Let's go say our final bye-bye to Aristotle." They had 2 more trips to make, back to Greece, then back to the modern day, where hopefully everything was hunky-dory. Then maybe they could spend a few months healing from the toll all that time-traveling took on their bodies. Dak reached out and put his hand on the cool metal of the ring. Then he gave one last glance at the banished prisoners. "I hope you guys learned your lesson. And don't be mad at us. It was Aristotle's idea, and we just do what we're told. He's the boss of the historians, you know." Sera loved the expression of confusion that swept over the face of Olympias. She pushed the button, and quantum physics took them back to Greece, far in the future and long ago, depending on how you looked at it. She just never knew how to think of such things anymore.
"I don't really know what to say,"
Aristotle said, as they sat on the balcony in the place they'd had their first deep discussion. Dak thought it seemed like thousands of years ago, which, in a way, was true.
"We've been through so much in such a relatively short period of time. It's hard to say goodbye to friends. Friendship is a single soul living in 2 bodies. Or in our case, 4. At least I'll get to see Hephaestion, again once the wars are over."
Dak nodded, not sure what to say himself. He was itching to get back to the modern day and make sure his parents were okay, and that the world wasn't, about to blow up into tiny pieces. Sera did the talking for them. "So, how are things going to work now?" she asked. "I know that talking about this stuff can drive you nuts, but since we corrected all the breaks, then that means you don't need to start the historians. But if you never start the historians, how will we know to go back and—" "Oh, never mind." Dak was glad she stopped. His head was starting to hurt. Aristotle chuckled, a great sound coming out of the great man. He looked 1,000,000 times better than he had right after the fighting.
"Not to worry, Sera. I suspect these things are simpler than we make them out to be. Most people will have no memory of the former timeline, though for you two they will remain linear recollections. In fact, including your remnants, you will have memories of 3 distinct timelines, in whole or in part."
Now Dak's head really hurt. "Boulders in the river of time. That's what I always say when I don't have a clue what anyone's talking about." That earned another couple of laughs, especially from Sera. After a few moments, Aristotle grew serious.
"Still, we know now that history is a special thing, and that it can be changed, but with dire consequences. I'm still going to form the historians and create a society that will last throughout the ages."
He paused, scratching that grand beard of his. Then he held up a finger in true philosopher form.
"But this time things will be a little different," the old man said. Instead of putting our focus on changing history, we will now do everything in our power to protect it. That's what we'll do, my friends. We will protect history until our last dying breaths."
Dak wanted to high-five the guy right there on the spot, but instead, he hugged him. Then came the goodbyes, along with more tears. Chapter 32. The Final Remnant. To the future they went. They warped to the historian headquarters first, but it wasn't there. Instead, all they saw was a big field lined with rows of corn. So they zapped themselves nearby to Sera's house next. Half of her was terrified to discover what awaited her in this new world, and the other half could hardly stand the wait. Dak had to break into a run to keep up with her as they made their way through the neighborhood. "Things sure seem normal," Dak said, slightly out of breath. "Yeah, they do, and it's weird about the historians being gone." But everything around them seemed brighter, the people happier, the colors and edges sharper. So far, they hadn't seen one sign of destruction or oppression. "I bet they still exist in some way," Dak responded. "Maybe they're a lot smaller now, without the SQ to fight? I don't know, but it sure looks like we recreated a pretty good planet, if I do say so myself." Sera slapped him on the back. "Say it all you want. By Jove, I think we've done it." Dak whacked her on the shoulder, though not as hard. "You know, funny that you say that. The phrase 'by Jove' originated in—" He trailed off, his face showing that he'd just been kidding. Although she honestly missed his constant spewing of historical facts, she hoped he relearned everything quickly so he could get back to it. And then they were there, her house, where her uncle had raised her, but she'd felt 1,000 remnants that her parents would arrive at any second. "They're alive," Dak said, standing by her, just as he'd always done. "I know it." She nodded, then let instinct take over. The next few minutes were like a dream, as if the remnants of her past were slowly unfolding to her like a storybook. The front door was locked. They rang the doorbell. No one answered. They went around the back, through the yard, down the little dusty lane, a long, beautiful, dreamy walk, to the barn, that barn way behind the house, and the doors opened, and out they came, her mom, her dad, smiling, talking, laughing. When they saw her, she bolted into a run, crossing the grassy distance faster than any horse ever could. They were shocked at her excitement when she hugged them fiercely, kissed them, laughed, and cried. "My goodness," her mom said, pulling back and looking delightedly at her daughter. "What in the world has come over you?" "I just missed you is all," Sera said. "I just missed you so much." The day had been a total blur for Dak. Everything had changed, yet in some ways it all felt the same, too. There was something perfect about it, and he felt happier than he had in a long time. After the incredible reunion between Sera and her parents, he was man enough to admit it, he'd gotten a bit choked up. They'd walked over to Dak's house, where his own mom and dad were busy in the lab, working on 20 projects at once. It was a huge relief when he saw them alive and well, but what really made him happy was that they were doing what they loved, solving the world's problems one by one. The Smiths and the Frosts had actually joined forces, forming a company to seek out, discover, and invent practical scientific solutions to everything from illness to environmental issues. Their company was called Solving Quantum Physics. Yup, Dak thought. The SQP. He thought that was just about the best thing ever. Dak. It was Sera, pulling him back to the real world. They were sitting on a big branch of their favorite tree, enjoying the cool air and the cleanness of it, drinking juice. She had a tablet out, scrolling through some article with taps of her fingers. It had caught her interest big time, judging by the look of her eyes. "So?" he asked. "What did you find?" "Oh, you know, just checking out the history of Alexander the Great. That's right, the Great, and his best friend, Hephaestion." Dak's jaw dropped. "What?" "Yeah, right." "I'm serious. Look for yourself. It's in the Encyclopedia Britannica." Dak took the tablet from her and read through the article she'd found. He couldn't believe it. He absolutely couldn't believe it. Alexander and his armies had crossed the world, fighting when they had to, but also bringing food and knowledge and resources to countless people. Rick, renamed Hephaestion by Alexander himself, had become a dear friend and confidant to the hegemon. He was thought by many to be the true force behind the king maintaining respect for other cultures at the same time as advancing the world in the greatest leap yet in human history. They called it the Iron Empire. Rick, Hephaestion, bestie to Alexander the Great. Dak realized he'd been holding his breath, and he let out a long and loud exhale. That's the single coolest thing I've ever read in my entire life. Our boy did pretty well, huh? That's our boy. Sera laughed, and Dak loved the sound of it. They'd come so close, so many times, to everything being ruined, to death, to the end of the world. It was good to be home again. It was really, really good. So, what do we do with this thing? Sera asked. She held up the satchel, the shape of the infinity ring obvious through the cloth. Dak stared at it for a long time, as if the answer might appear in the stitches. I don't know. I think once my head doesn't feel like it got beaten by a hammer from warping so much, I might be tempted to go hang out in ancient Rome for a few days. Sera shook her head. I know you're kidding, but we really can't do that. It seems like the world is in pretty good shape, and we better not mess it up. So, what are you saying? That we should destroy it? Like Rick did with Tilda's eternity ring? No way. Who knows what might happen in the future, or the past? Yeah, Dak agreed. We're safe for now, but you never know. So, let's decide where to put the ring. Sera shrugged. I guess we can wrap it in plastic, put it in a box, bury it. I say we give normal life a chance for a while. Sound good? Sounds good times infinity. They were silent for a while, listening to birds and wind and rustling leaves. The branch swayed a little, making Dak sleepy. It'd be nice to take a nap and not worry if the world might end the next day. It was fun, huh? Sera finally said. Dak looked at her. His best friend. Yeah, it was. Not that I'd want to do it again. Me neither. But I'll never forget what we did. Save the world? Dak asked. Yep, save the world. And I'm glad it was with you. She smiled then, and Dak decided not to say anything back. Sometimes words just weren't enough. Epilogue. Golden. Tilda sat, crouched, withered, dying, in the filthy corner of the alley. All of majestic Athens rose up around her, but no one cared about the sad little woman with the hair that once shone like flames. Now it was dull and lifeless and limp, like the last dying embers of a once mighty fire. She huddled, cold despite the heat, hungry despite the rat she'd just eaten. Shivering, she leaned against the wall and wept. Every day she'd cried, hopeless and hating the world, hating the historians, hating that boy, that girl, that other boy. They'd done this to her. They'd ruined her. They'd ruined her future. Oh, how she hated them. But it didn't matter. It was over. Though not gracious in defeat, she at least knew she'd been beaten. The SQ was no more. And so, she'd wait. She'd wait for death. The next day, it still hadn't come. That evening, a light flashed nearby, accompanied by the crackling sounds of thunder and sparks. Wind rushed through the alley, picking up leaves and trash, pelting her body. Then a sudden darkness blossomed, making her feel as if she'd been cast into a dungeon. Scared, she shifted, trying to shrink farther into the corner. The shadow of a man stood before her. It took a while, but her eyes adjusted, and she could finally see him standing there, silent and watchful. He was bald, and hideous scars marked his face. He wore a robe, its hood pulled down around his shoulders, and there was something terribly wrong with one of his eyes, though she couldn't quite see well enough to know for sure. "Who are you?" she asked in a rasp, her throat dry as decayed bones. The man sank toward the ground and knelt before her. That eye! She could see it now, bloodshot and puffy, like it was riddled with disease. "My name doesn't matter," he answered, his voice deep. "I'm a descendant of Ilsa, the only name we speak."
"Ilsa?"
Tilda repeated. "Yes. I have something to show you." The man pulled out a metallic object, shining golden even in the scant light. Tilda recognized the shape, the sign for infinity. Her heart leapt back to life, consumed with so much joy she worried of dying, right there in the alley, the victim of too much emotion at once. "What? How?" she sputtered, confusion threatening to destroy her elation at seeing the device. The man spoke with soothing tones. "Ilsa commanded her posterity to study the sciences, find a way to travel through time. And we've done it. And you, Tilda, you are our first mission. I was sent here to get you." He reached out and gently helped her stand up, his touch bringing a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you," she said, too dazed to find any other words. "Come," he said, holding out the golden device for her to grasp. "We need you to show us the way." This is Dion Graham. We hope that you have enjoyed this production of Infinity Ring Book 7, The Iron Empire, by James Dashner. This program was produced and directed by Scott Sherritt. Executive producer, Hall R. Gagney. Post-production by John Van Horn. Recorded by Ethan Donaldson. Original music by Susan Jane. Text and production copyright 2013 by Scholastic Inc. All rights reserved.